Okay, so today's lecture is on chapter 7. This is on the axial skeleton. So last week we covered um, the histology of bone and cartilage, right? So starting with this chapter, and then in the next couple chapters, we're going to actually be talking about the different bones. We're going to start with the axial skeleton, which is the head, neck, and trunk. And then chapter 8 will be the appendicular skeleton, the appendages, the upper limbs and the lower limbs. And then we're going to see that throughout this semester, this kind of pattern, where we start with the histology, the cells, um, like the bone cells, and the next unit will be the muscle cells, and then we'll work on the axial region and then the appendicular in the different chapters. Okay. And I just wanted to say that if you guys have any questions, please speak up. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know, okay? So as I mentioned before, your skeleton has typically 206 bones in an adult. In children, there tend to be more bones when we talk about bone counts, but there are 206 in the adult. In the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, vertebral column, and thoracic cage. There are 80. And in the appendicular, the upper and lower limbs, you have 126. So that's 206 bones. And I was mentioning before for your exam, don't brute force memorize to get through all the bones because you're not going to be able to do it. So I hope you take this time to actually learn the material and not just go through image by image, page by page, and just brute force memorize because that's going to be really, really tough. One thing you should definitely know for the exam are the bone counts, okay? Because I can definitely have some questions on the bone counts here. So your skull has 22 bones. There are 7 additional associated bones with the skull, 26 in the vertebral column and 25 in the thoracic cage. That gives you 80 in the axial skeleton. And then we're going to go through each one, okay? So one of the things I think help with learning about the bones is breaking it up into different sections or regions or groups, making it a little more digestible and easier to learn. So we're going to start with the skull, and there are only 22 bones in there. I know 80 bones, 126 bones, 206 bones. That seems overwhelming when you look at those bone counts and those really big numbers. But if you break it up into chunks, they definitely get a lot easier. Okay. I also want to point out in your book, there's a really nice table that talks about anatomical features of these bones. It's in chapter 6, and if you don't have the textbook, it could be in different chapters, but a lot of the textbooks will have something similar to this. So what this is, it will talk about the general structure or a feature on the bone. They'll have the anatomical name and then what the description is. So when we talk about articulating surface, so we'll start with this articulating surface here. That's where a bone meets with another bone. This is a joint, okay? So where bones meet bones, there will be several features that are consistent throughout all the bones. So a condyle is something that is usually a large rounded structure, okay? It's on a bone, and if it's on a long bone, it's like a round ball on the bone itself, and that's where it can meet up with another bone, okay? And what the condyle usually joins up with is what we call a facet, okay? So a facet is a small, flat, shallow surface, and that usually meets up with a condyle. It's kind of a lock and key, okay? A head is another round region, and trochlea is a groove process. And whenever you see the word process when we're talking about bones, it's something that sticks out. of the bone. Okay, so anything that projects out or sticks out is known as a process. So trochlea, head, facet, condyles, they're all things that stick out from a bone, and they join up with another bone. Okay. One of the things about this table, again, I don't want you to memorize this table. It's not it's not helpful to just, again, brute force memorize this. I want you to go through and be familiar with these terms, and you'll see it when we talk about bones, specific bones. You'll see when condyles pop up, heads pop up, trochlea pop up, and then you'll remember that these are articulating surfaces and what they look like, and they'll help you when you learn about the bones. The next general structure is a depression, and these are pits or pockets or grooves. Okay, so an alveolus, fossa, sulcus, these are pits on the bone surface where other things can attach to, like tendons or ligaments or other bones. Talked a little bit about this before. Projections. Okay, projections are anything that sticks out, and usually you have a projection for a tendon or ligament to attach to. So crest, a line, epicondyle, the process, we talked about that. Ramus, spine, trochanter, tubercles, tuberosities. These are bumps and projections and things that stick out from the bone itself. Okay. And then you have holes and openings and spaces. So canals, fissures, foramina is the plural, a sinus. They're all holes and openings and spaces inside the bone. Okay. And so when we go through specific bones, you can't just learn about the name of the bone itself. There are many different anatomical features of these bones that you'll have to know for the test. Okay, so it's not just the 206 bones, but you also need to know the important anatomical features. Now, I'll point out the really important ones and the ones that are most likely to show up on the test. There's a lot of them in your textbook, and if you have a different textbook, it's going to point out many, many more. But please pay attention to the ones that I point out in my slides and the ones that I point out during lecture and on Canvas. Okay. So when we're looking at an anterior view of the skull, so this is looking face on, right? This is a coronal view of the skull. You'll see a lot of different bones here. Okay. This is a lateral view, right, from the side. In fact, this is from the right side. This is from the top, a superior view. This is from the back. This is from the bottom. And you can notice the bottom has this giant hole, which we'll talk about a little bit. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a giant hole here, and that's where the brainstem and the spinal cord go through. So you can orient yourself when you're looking at an image like this to know exactly where we are and what view we're in. Okay. If you were to crack open the skull, you'll see this is the bottom again. This is the giant hole, the foramen magnum right there, as well as other bones here. And we'll go through each one of these, okay? So the skull bones, as I mentioned before, has 22 bones, all right? This is divided into two different categories, cranial and facial. There are 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. And the difference is that the 8 cranial bones have direct contact with the brain. So if a bone is touching the brain, it is considered a cranial bone. If it's a bone in the skull, but it does not touch the brain, it's one of the 14 facial bones. So you have 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, 1 occipital, 1 sphenoid, and 1 ethmoid. And then in the facial bones, the 14 are 2 zygomatic, left and right, 2 lacrimal, 2 maxillae bones, 2 palatine, 1 mandible, 2 nasal, 2 inferior nasal conchae, and 1 vomer. Okay. And this is the inferior nasal concave. I'll point out it's kind of odd. It looks odd there, like where's the superior nasal concave? You might be asking, and we'll point that out as well. Okay, but this is considered a separate bone itself. All right, so here's the frontal view. This is the one that we looked at before. Okay, the superior bone, the one shaded in red here, is known as the frontal bone. That's the one on top, okay? That's in the front. Makes sense, right? You have a really flat surface. That's your forehead. It's a really flat surface named the squamous part of the bone, right? Flat, squamous part of the bone. And if we move inferiorly, we're going to hit the top part of the orbits of your eye socket, okay? That's the top part of your orbit. Your brow is known as the superciliary arch. That's a superciliary arch, okay? And where it hits the end of the eye socket orbit, that's the supraorbital margin, okay? That's the end of the frontal bone, the supraorbital margin. That's supraorbital on top of the orbit, okay? Right, as we move immediately on the supraorbital margin, you're going to see a hole right there. That's the supraorbital foramen. Okay. There's a hole right there, supraorbital foramen. You have that on the left and right sides. And then in between that, right in between your two eye sockets right here, this is known as the glabella region, or the glabellar region. This is where you get a lot of wrinkles in the glabella region. And if you are ever to get Botox, I know a lot of people get Botox and you want to get rid of those wrinkles, that's where you do a Botox injection right there in the glabella region. I have a question. Alan asked, will I be recording today's meeting and upload to Canvas? Yes, I will. So it's currently being recorded right now. And then I hopefully will have this video. It takes about a day or two for the videos to render, and then I'll upload it to Canvas. All right, on the top, the superior part of the skull, on either side, you have two parietal bones. I know we talked about parietal membrane before. This is different, okay? There are two parietal bones in the skull as well, right? There's a bumpy part, a ridge right here known as a parietal eminence, okay? Parietal eminence. And then there are two lines known as the superior temporal and the inferior temporal lines. Again, lines are things that stick out. The sharp edges that stick out from either side of the parietal bone. I know I'm flying through these, but slow me if you have any questions. One of the bones that look very unique is the temporal bone, and you have two temporal bones, left and right. So this is a lateral view, you know, from this actually from the right side. This is the right temporal bone, and you can tell because it has this this arm that sticks out. Okay, it has a round region, and then this arm that sticks out, and that's the temporal bone. So if I can show you this on a test, you should be able to very distinctly tell me, oh, this is a temporal bone right here. So the flat surface is known as the squamous part. And then you have this hole right there known as the tympanic part. What do you think goes through this hole? What do you think is going through this hole right here?
Isn't tympanic refers to like eardrum, right? Or something like that?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is where your ears are, right? Your ear canal will go through this. And remember, this is a cranial bone, so it touches the brain, right? So This is where sound goes through and gets to your auditory cortex in the brain. So the tympanic part has the acoustic meatus right there. Okay, that's the acoustic meatus. And then behind it, posterior to that, is a bump right here. This bump known as the mastoid process. That bump is the mastoid process right there. Okay. As we move inferiorly, there is a little island or a little promenade that comes out. This is known as the styloid process. Now, there are a lot of bones that will have a styloid process, and on the temporal bone, the styloid process is here. Okay. And then the arm that is very distinct of the temporal bone right here is known as the zygomatic process. Okay, zygomatic process. Now, I don't want you guys to be confused because there is a separate zygomatic bone. Okay, there's a zygomatic bone. This arm is known as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, so you just have to know that this thing that sticks out is called the zygomatic process. And where does it live? It lives on the temporal bone.
Professor, so that's not related to the zygomatic arch, right?
That is related to the zygomatic arch. Yeah,
Okay.
very good question. That is related to the zygomatic arch. So what do you think this connects to? What do you think this will join up to? In fact, I will show you, it joins up to this bone right here.
Maxillary. The maxillary? Or?
That's not the maxilla. That's not the maxilla. It's a good guess. Maxilla is below it.
Oh, no, sorry, the zygomatic your
Bone.
cheekbone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is known as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone because it connects to the zygomatic bone. Okay, now I'm spending a little bit of time here because a lot of students get confused. Okay, a lot of students get confused. They see the word and they're like zygomatic. Well, I have a bone, a separate bone that's a zygomatic bone. No, the bone here in front of it, that's a zygomatic bone. The thing that connects to it is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. I know, very confusing, but make sure you understand that when you review this, okay? So this zygomatic process articulates with the zygomatic bone, okay? It joins up with the zygomatic bone, but it lives on the temporal bone.
Wait, so are zygomatic arch and zygomatic process the same thing or different?
Yeah. So what happens is that this zygomatic process connects to what you'll see is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, this part, okay? And it forms a bridge. It forms a bridge here, and that bridge is the zygomatic arch. Together, it forms this zygomatic arch. It's both sides of the bridge.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, very good questions. Yeah, again, ask all the questions, slow me down, because there's a lot of material here, okay? On the medial side, on the inside, so if we're looking on the inside, okay, of the skull, and this is where the brain is, the other side of the temporal bone is known as the petrous part. This is important for hearing and balance, okay? So the acoustic meatus goes through here, right? That's the whole acoustic meatus comes through the tympanic part right there, and that's a whole, but this is known as the petrous part, all right? So temporal bone has a squamous part, a tympanic part, a petrous part, acoustic meatus, mastoid process, styloid process, zygomatic process. Good. All right. As we move back, okay, posterior to the backbone, this is known as the occipital bone. Okay, this is the occipital bone. So it's back and bottom. You have the squamous part, that's the flat part. And then you have several bumps and lines. Okay, so you can actually feel on the back of your skull, you can feel all those bumps, right? And that's not where your mom dropped you as a kid. Okay, those bumps are supposed to be there. The top bump right below the flat part, that top bump right there is known as the occipital protuberance. It's the big one. It's the big bump right in the center, okay? That's the occipital protuberance. And on either side of the occipital protuberance are nuchal lines. nuchal lines. Okay, you have the superior nuchal line and inferior nuchal line. Connecting those is the external occipital crest that goes right down the center of your occipital bone. Okay, so all those bumps right there, you got the occipital protuberance, occipital crest, and the nuchal lines. And then remember that giant hole right there? Hole, foramen, right? Foramen means hole, and it's a big hole, so foramen magnum. That big hole is foramen magnum. And so it's very, very distinct of the occipital bone that you see this giant hole. And this is where the brainstem goes through the foramen magnum. And then you have 2 feet right here. You have 2 feet on the bottom of the bone. This is known as the occipital condyles. Okay. And the occipital condyles is where the skull will sit on your vertebral column. Okay, so these feet will stand on top of your vertebral column. And then the front part is known as the basilar part. So in front of the foramen magnum, so this is anterior, this is posterior, and anterior to the foramen magnum is the basilar part. So far, so good. Any questions? Those are easy, right? Those are pretty easy. The next cranial bone is known as the sphenoid. This is the sphenoid bone, right? And you can best look at the sphenoid. It is colored in purple here when you crack open the skull and you look down. And it kind of looks like a bat with wings right here. Okay, it kind of looks like a bat with wings. And that's what they're actually called. So you have the smaller wing, the lesser wing. Okay, and then you have the greater wings out here. There's a hole right there known as the optic canal. That is where your optic nerve goes through. Foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. Okay, all these holes have names. Rotundum, ovale, spinosum. Okay, and then right in the center of the sphenoid bone is a little chair. Okay, right here, there's a little chair. This is known as the sella turcica. Okay, and that chair is where your pituitary gland will sit from your brain. So the pituitary gland, very important for growth hormones, for a lot of your sex hormones will come out of your pituitary glands. So that pituitary gland needs to be protected, and it sits in this little chair called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It's right in the middle of the sphenoid bone right there. That's the sella turcica. Okay. The sphenoid is what we call a keystone bone because it connects both cranial bones and facial bones. It will touch both cranial and facial. On the back of the sphenoid, there you can see the greater wing and the lesser wing right there. So lesser is smaller, greater is bigger. So the greater wing, the lesser wing, here's the body of the bone. And then you have 2 pterygoid, the P is silent, pterygoid processes. And this is what attaches to the mandible for your jaw attachment, right? So your mandible can attach and you can chew. So this is a frontal look of the sphenoid, and this is a posterior look of the sphenoid. Another cranial bone is the ethmoid. And this one's a little harder to picture. It's in between the orbits and it's behind. Okay, so it's behind your nasal bones, but it's touching the brain. So here's your sphenoid, and then behind it, here's your ethmoid right there. Okay, here's another look. If we took a lateral view, here's your orbits, your eye sockets, then here's your ethmoid behind it, behind your eye sockets. Okay, this also looks like a moth or a bat with wings right here. This is between your orbits, your eye sockets, anteromedial, so in the front and towards the middle floor of the cranium, so it's on the bottom. roof of the nasal cavity. So if you look up the nostril, you can see a little bit of the ethmoid right there. And it's in front of the sphenoid. Okay, so here's the sphenoid. Here's the ethmoid. Here's another look at the ethmoid. Again, another bat with wings, right? Kind of like a bat right here. So this body of the bat right here is known as the perpendicular plate. Okay, that's the perpendicular plate. The middle part of the body is known as the cribriform. Here's your cribriform, and it's got a bunch of holes in there. Bunch of holes for olfactory nerves. Do you guys know what olfactory means?
Smell.
Yeah, very good. So this connects to your nostril. Your olfactory nerves will come out of these holes, and that's what senses smell. Okay, so it goes through the cribriform plate up to your brain. The part that is actually touching your brain is this little fin that comes up right here. That is known as the crista galli. That's the crista galli. Okay, that is the part that actually touches the brain. And then on the wings here of the ethmoid, you've got a lot of air pockets. Okay, because this is for smell and for breathing. So it allows for nasal airflow, a lot of pockets. You have the superior nasal concha and middle nasal concha. Okay, so superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha. All right. So the one missing, you're like, okay, you have superior, you have middle, whereas inferior. And as I mentioned about 10 minutes ago, the inferior nasal concha are actually considered a separate bone. So you have superior, middle, and then inferior. They're separate bones, so categorized as a separate bone. And we'll talk about it, not just a feature of the ethmoid. Okay. So it's considered one of the facial bones.
Wait, is it just separated because it doesn't touch the brain, or?
Doesn't touch the brain. It's categorized because it's attached to the ethmoid, but it connects to it, but it really is separated. When they categorized the ethmoid, they just called this region of the ethmoid the superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, but the inferior nasal concha is an actual separate bone itself.
Okay.
Yeah. I know it's anatomists, right? It's kind of odd, it's kind of weird that they just put things into different categories just to screw with you. But yeah. But that's why I'm pointing it out for you, okay? So that you guys can tell the difference. By the way, concha with an A here, that's singular. If you put an E, conchae, that's plural. It's Latin, okay? So put an E, that makes it plural. So far, so good? Yes. Hopefully, yes.
Hopefully.
Okay, those are your 8 cranial bones. Pretty easy, huh? That's pretty easy. Those are your 8 cranial bones, okay? They all touch the brain, and I've kind of talked about how they all touch the brain. And they all connect to each other. They all connect to each other. They form what we call sutures. They're called sutures, okay? This is the joint in the skull, okay? Sutures. They're immovable, which is a good thing. They don't move. They're glued tight shut, so you don't just crack open your skull to hit the brain. And there are 4 of them that I want you to know for the test, okay? There are 4 major sutures that I want you to know. If I'm looking top down, okay, between the frontal bone and the 2 parietal bones, this suture right here, this one right here, this is known as the coronal suture. Coronal, okay? Between the frontal bone and the parietal bones, this is the coronal suture. Between the left and right parietal down here, just coming down here, this is known as the sagittal suture. This is the sagittal suture. And then on the occipital, separating the occipital and the parietal back here, this is known as the lambdoid suture, lambdoid. Make sure you know how to spell this for the test. Lambdoid. Okay, lambdoid suture. Right, that separates the two parietal from the occipital bone. Here's another look at the lambdoid suture. Here's the lambdoid. All right. Boom. There are sutural bones there that you might see. Don't worry about those, but that's your lambdoid suture. And a lateral view, here's your coronal. Here's your coronal from your frontal and parietal. Here's your lambdoid. And then separating the temporal bone and the parietal bone right here. This is known as the sagittal suture. This is the sagittal suture. This is also where you can see a lateral view. You can see the frontal bone, parietal, temporal, and here's the sphenoid. Okay, here's the greater wing of the sphenoid. So where these four bones meet, this region right there, that region right there that I'm circling is known as the pterion. Again, the P is silent. This is the pterion. Okay, so frontal, parietal, temporal, sphenoid. This is sagittal suture, coronal suture. This is known as the pterion. You crack open the bone, the skull, you can see several depressions or divots, okay? These are known as cranial fossa. So in the skull itself, you can see these depressions, these divots, okay? Cranial fossa. The one on the front, from your frontal bone, is the anterior cranial fossa. Here you can see it in red, okay? The thing poking out right there, that's the cribriform plate, crista galli. On either side of the temporal and the sphenoid right here, this depression right here is known as the middle cranial fossa. And then here you can see the foramen magnum, the one in purple, that's the occipital bone. This depression right here is the posterior, so anterior, middle, posterior cranial fossa. And this is what cradles the cerebellum of the brain. Okay, that's the posterior. The middle cradles the temporal lobe, if you know what that is. And the anterior cradles the frontal lobe of the brain, which we'll talk about in the next unit. So those are your 8 cranial bones. As you can see, I went through them pretty quickly, but the bones themselves, not too bad, 8 of them, but I did go through a lot of different features, okay? A lot of different features on a lot of the different bones. So you definitely want to know those, especially the ones that I point out, right? So even though it's 8, it's, you know, doesn't look like it's too much, but there's a lot of other features that you have to know. You also have to know the different sutures, okay, the different sutures, as well as the cranial fossa. Then moving on to facial, okay, 14 facial bones in the skull, no contact with the brain, does not touch the brain, but it's in the skull. You have 2 zygomatic, 2 lacrimal, 2 maxillae, 2 palatine, 2 nasal, 1 mandible, 2 inferior nasal conchae, and 1 vomer. So here's the zygomatic bone. These are your cheekbones, okay? Looks like a downward arrow. This is your cheekbone. So this downward arrow here, okay, you can actually feel it on your face, the cheekbones that you feel. You're feeling this, the arrow part right there. It has 3 sides that stick out, right? The one that sticks out to the back, the posterior part, that's known as the temporal process. We've seen that before, right? Temporal bone, temporal process. So this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. All right, I know it's very confusing. I want you guys to spend some time, make sure it makes sense to you. The temporal process touches The temporal bone. It points to the temporal bone. Okay. Joins up with the temporal process of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Very confusing, I know. Okay. So this part that sticks up, that goes up, is known as the frontal process. What do you think that will touch? What do you think this part will join up with?
The
If it's
forehead.
Frontal bone.
frontal bone, the forehead, yes, frontal bone, right? Temporal process touches the temporal bone, frontal process touches the frontal bone. Maxillary process will touch the maxilla. Yes, makes sense. Okay, so this will touch the maxilla. And then this part will form part of the eye socket, the orbital surface. And you can see here, this is an inferior view. You can see the zygomatic arch right there. Okay, so the temporal process here of the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone will form this bridge, will form this arch. You can see an opening right there. That's the zygomatic arch. And your cheekbones, you know, so a lot of boxers, or if you've ever been punched in the face, okay, the first thing you probably crack is this bridge, the temporal process, the zygomatic process, that zygomatic arch. That's the first thing you'll probably crack if you get punched in the cheekbones, right there. So a lot of boxers, they get hit in the face, and they'll crack the zygomatic arch. Lacrimal bone, tiny bone right here. So this one in blue, this is the lacrimal bone. Do you know what the lacrimal gland is for? What's lacrimal mean?
Tears.
Tears, yes. Yes, tears, okay. So there's a lacrimal bone, okay, in green right there. And then right below it is a lacrimal groove. Lacrimal groove. Also known, it's for your nasal lacrimal duct. Okay, nasal lacrimal duct. So have you ever watched a really sad movie like The Notebook or Marley and Me, and you're crying a lot? You're just crying. It's like an ugly cry too, right? It's an ugly cry. You're sobbing, and
Or just this test.
huh?
Or just this test.
This test, you were sobbing like after this test, right? And you become like snotty. You're like, well, how come, you know, I have all this fluid in my like nostril after crying? Well, you're crying, right? All those tears go through the lacrimal groove into the nasal lacrimal duct, and then that actually goes into your nasal cavity. Okay, so this connects to your nasal cavity, and that's why you're all snotty after. It's your tears going into your snot region. Okay, so part of your snot, or your notebook tears, your Marley and Me tears, and your anatomy test tears. Sorry. Don't worry, we'll have time for this test, okay? We'll have time for this test. I know. We'll gauge where you guys are, and we'll see where we are with the test. So that's your lacrimal. You have two lacrimal bones. And then you have the upper jaw. That's the maxilla. So one maxilla, two maxillae. So you have two of these, left and right. You can see teeth here, your upper teeth. The teeth are not bone. Okay, they're not considered the bone that we go through. I know visually you'll see it here, but we won't really talk about the teeth. Just because the skull would be really weird if we didn't have any teeth. So forms the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate. So the roof of your mouth is hard, right? That's known as your hard palate. It's bony. Okay, 2/3 of that is maxilla. The back 1/3 is the palatine bone, which I'll show in a little bit. So in orange right here, this is the roof of your mouth. That's the hard palate and formed by your maxilla. Splitting the left and right maxillae is the incisive foramen. So there's a hole right there. There's a hole in your mouth. Yes, a hole in the roof of your mouth. And that's your incisive foramen. Okay, that's where your nasopalatine nerve goes through, goes up and down. Then you've got coverings, these alveolar pockets, these little pockets right here, for your teeth to go into. Up here is another little hole, foramen, right? So anytime you see a hole and I point to it on test, you should probably write foramen, okay? Just write foramen because at least get some partial credit. Foramen means hole. Most likely than not, I'm going to be talking about foramina, like what type of foramen. So even if you don't remember infraorbital, write foramen down, get something down, get some partial credit, and then hopefully that will jog your memory. And this will be the infraorbital foramen or the incisive foramen. The back 1/3 is known as the palatine bones. Okay. So in green right here, forms this L shape. You have the perpendicular plate, horizontal plate, and then goes from the roof of your mouth down here all the way up to your eyeballs. Okay, orbital process. So from the roof, one bone connects the roof of your mouth to your eyeballs. This is the palatine bone. Got two holes on either side, palatine foramen. Okay, one palatine foramen, multiple palatine foramina. And this is the nerves for your teeth. Lower jaw, that's the mandible. Okay, that's the mandible. You've got alveolar pockets covering your lower teeth. Here's the body of the mandible, an arm that comes up called the ramus, okay? There's the head or the condylar process and the coronoid process, okay? Head or condylar process, coronoid process, and then there's a U that connects them. That's the mandibular notch, okay? That's the mandibular notch. Coming down the ramus, you have the angle of mandible. That's the angle, very important. We'll talk about what the angle signifies or tells you, okay? The chin right here, the chin is known as the mental part, and the part that sticks out is the mental protuberance. Okay, so mental is chin, and the chin that sticks out is the mental protuberance. And then you also have a hole down here as well, and that's the mental foramen, a hole in your chin, okay, mental foramen. And usually these holes, the foramen, that's for nerves and blood vessels to go through. So that's the mandible. Nasal bones in purple right here, left and right nasal bones. Okay. Not that interesting. And then we talked about this a little bit before. Here's your inferior nasal concha, right? So this is the ethmoid that have superior and middle nasal concha, part of it. And then highlighted in green, that's the inferior nasal concha right there, okay? Here's the ethmoid again in red, crista galli, cribriform plate, superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and then right below it, inferior in green. See, so it's not really attached to the ethmoid. They're just similar structures. That's why they have similar names. And then goes down to the roof of your mouth, right? So on either side of your nostrils, inferior nasal concha. And then if I look down from your nostril, so if I look up, that's the ethmoid. If I look down, this is the vomer. This is the vomer. What I will see is this Y-shaped, okay, if I look straight on, this is the Y-shape, okay? And this is what forms the lower half of your nasal septum. So you have two nostrils, right? If you look in a mirror, you have left and right nostrils. So that wall is the nasal septum, right? That wall that separates them is the nasal septum. And what forms that is this vomer, okay? So you have the Y-shaped, the wings up here is known as the ala, and then you have a vertical plate that comes down. And if I look from the side, you have this, the vertical plate actually goes all the way back, right there. Okay. So that's a vomer in yellow right there. Don't worry too much about this slide. This is known as your nasal complex. So if you were to slice your face in half, you'll see this network right here. All right. So your nasal passageways is not just one or two bones, right? Yes, you do have nasal bones, right? But the nasal passageway is actually very complex. It's formed by 7 different bones that will form this maze or network for air to go through. Okay, so when you breathe in through your nose, it's not just touching your nasal bones, it's touching 7 other bones that help move the air through. So that's basically what this slide says. Don't worry so much that, you know, the specific details. Just know that the nasal passageway is very complex, and it has 7 different bones associated with it. Also associated with these, this tunnel are paranasal sinuses. Okay, sinuses are cavities within the skull, and this is where air can flow, but it can also be trapped in. That's why when you say when you're sick, you have sinus pressure. That's because in these passageways, in these cavities, air is trapped, and that's causing pressure. That's putting pressure on your nerves in your brain. And that's why you feel some pain. So when you say you have sinus pain, it's air being trapped in one of these cavities. But the reason why we have them, okay, is so that your body can warm up and humidify the air. So when it's like really cold outside, you step outside and you take a deep breath. If you breathe through your mouth, it goes from your mouth into your lungs, right? Have you guys ever done that? And it's really cold air, and your lungs start to burn, right? That's because your lungs do not like extreme temperatures. Your body is kept normally at around 98 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, so if you breathe in something so extreme, extremely different than body temperature through your mouth and that quickly, your lungs don't like that, and it burns. Okay, so that's why when you train athletes, you always tell them, or runners, you tell them to breathe in through your nose, right? In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. The reason why you do that is not just for one-way flow or circulation. It's because when you breathe through in your nose, it can go through this nasal sinus passageway, this nasal complex, right? And it's going through this tunnel, and it's touching the sides of your skin, and it's touching the parts of your body. And what happens is that it warms up the air and humidifies it. Okay, so it's not too dry, and it's not too cold. So it'll warm up and humidify that air. Okay, so that when you breathe in and it hits your lungs, it's at the right temperature. 4 major types of sinuses: frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid, maxillary. That's associated with the bones in your skull.
Do we have to know this because you're mentioning it, or?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, why? Was that so complex? Was that something that?
Just making
No?
sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Same thing with your eye socket, okay? Orbital complex. You don't have an eye bone. There's no eye bone, right? Your orbit, your eye socket, where your eyeballs go into, it's made up of different bones. All right. That's the take home, that you have different bones associated that make up your orbital complex. All right, now there are 3 bones associated with the skull that are not technically skull bones. Actually, four. There are four bones. They're not technically skull bones, okay? They're just associated with the skull. There are three auditory bones or auditory ossicles. And these are in your temporal bone. They help with hearing. This is known as the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. So this is the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrups, right? So you know when you have the malleus, the hammer, that's beating on the incus, and that moves. So your malleus, as sound is going through your ears, that's moving the malleus. That changes the incus, and the stapes will beat back and forth, and that's hitting your eardrum. Okay, we'll talk more about these bones when we talk about senses and sound, but these are three tiny bones. In fact, these are the tiniest bones that you have in your body, right? These are the smallest bones that you have in your body, the auditory ossicles. And another bone is known as the hyoid. Now, a lot of skeletons that you'll see will be missing this. It is below the mandible. It's in your throat. Okay, it's in your throat. It's below the mandible. It does not articulate with any other bone. I'm going to repeat that. The hyoid does not articulate with any other bone. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Anything else?
It does not touch any other bone. It's kind of just floating out there in your throat. And you're like, yeah, I have a bone that's just floating. Yeah, it's kind of odd. All right. So what it attaches to your tongue and muscles in your larynx. Okay, in your larynx. So it has this C-shaped. It's kind of C-shaped. It has a large body, and then it's got these horns that stick out. So the big horn is known as the greater cornu, and the smaller horns are the lesser cornu. And in fact, if you go below the mandible with your hand, and you feel, palpate with your fingers towards the back of your throat, you might feel two little bumps. Okay, two little bumps. That is the greater cornu that you're feeling. And if you can actually gently slide it back and forth, and you can feel that it's actually not touching any of the bone. It's just touching your muscles, and it can slide easily back and forth like that. It's kind of trippy, but the reason why it doesn't, the hyoid helps with swallowing. So when you swallow, the muscles move, and it moves this bone up and down. So far, so good. Any questions?